So we now have a panel. The panel focuses on science and how science and as it relates to agriculture research can advance global food security. I'm not going to introduce the whole panel, but I'd ask them to come out, and it's chaired by Dr. Barbara Schaal, who's the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and Distinguished Professor at Washington University in St. Louis. And Barbara, you should just go ahead and introduce the panel, and you may proceed.
We're now going to have our first panel, and it's a new science of agriculture to advance global food security. It's really a pleasure to be able to introduce this very distinguished panel of representatives from government, business, international organizations, civil society, and universities. I'm not going to read their whole biography. It's extremely extensive, but let me just introduce them briefly. Mr. Brent Begemann, President and Chief Commercial Officer of Monsanto Company. Dr. Bert Garza, Provost of Boston College. Dr. Rob Horsch, Deputy Director of Research and Development, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Dr. Mauricio Antonio Lopes, President, Brazilian Agricultural Research Corporation. Dr. Lindiwe Sibanda, Chief Executive Officer and Head of Mission, Food and Agriculture Natural Resources Policy Analysis Network. And Dr. Ren Wang, Assistant Director General, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Let me just have a note on the format. Each panel member is going to have a question. I'm going to address a question to them. They're going to respond in about 3 to 5 minutes. When all of the panel members have contributed answers to their questions, then we'd like to have a free-flowing dialogue among the panel where the panel members comment on each other's answers, and we begin to really develop and go into deeply some of these issues. We may have a second round of questions, and then we will also have a single question that's going to be addressed from Twitter, and I'm hoping that that's a very provocative question. So we're ready to go. First is to Dr. Sibanda. You have worked extensively with small-scale farmers throughout Africa. How should agricultural research be adapted to take into account the needs of smallholders?
Thank you very much, Barbara. I think the challenge that we face in Africa is the disjoint between research and the farmers' livelihoods. And I think we always want to have researchers who parachute with solutions and technologies, and yet the farmers are innovators in their own right. So I think the first thing that needs to be done is to define the goal. What is the desired impact? Why is someone into farming? Where do they see themselves in 10, 20 years' time? And I think that's the conversation that should then ground the engagement and lead to the next level. So if you're in the business of farming, number 2, what are the resources, the assets that a farmer needs for them to go into productive and sustainable agriculture? The next thing that I think we grapple with is failure to link the farmer aspirations to the national development agenda. We failed to have researchers who take a system-wide approach to research because the training for most of them is siloed. It's specialized into specific disciplines, and when they look at a farmer, they want to engage them within the context of their own discipline. So there is need to open up and have multidisciplinary teams that engage with farmers within their livelihood asset base. I think the other thing that has been missing is that in Africa, there is a plethora of successful projects, but taking those to scale is always a challenge. And what has always been missing is the interface with research of policymakers. Now, in most cases, research is done in isolation from the policy that's required to accompany the uptake of the technologies. And also the decision makers, they are not in a conversation across the different disciplines to agree on what it would take to bring the interventions to scale. And then finally, I think there's the issue of capacity, and it's capacity on both sides. It's capacity of the researchers, it's capacity of intermediary institutions, where in some cases they don't even exist, that have to interface between farmers, research, and policymakers and private sector. And I think taking a holistic approach to what are the farmers' aspirations in terms of the desired goals, what innovations will take them there, and accepting that the farmers too are innovators, and getting the interventions and science to accompany farmer innovations bottom up. I think that has been the challenge. And I think it calls for new skills that most of our researchers don't have. It calls for new partnerships that most researchers are scared of, especially when you talk to researchers about bringing in private sector from the onset. It's what is their role? We don't have a technology yet. Why should we bring them in? And then bringing the goodwill from the policymakers to make sure they open the space for upscaling. Now, if I were to sum up and say, what have we learned in this engagement? I think what really makes research uptake easy and relevant and adaptable is visionary leadership. There's got to be buy-in at political level to say we need to invest in research as Africa. Currently, there is a commitment by African governments to commit 1% of their GDP to research, but none of the countries except South Africa are putting that money, and the results are clear. So we need to prioritize investments in research at local level. And then research has to be long-term investments. It cannot be project-based on a 3-5-year cycle. We have to look at the long term, because it is that staying power that brings credibility, because it's a learning cycle. Both the researchers are learning and the farmers are learning. And then there's the issue of bringing in other players. We need to demystify in the African context what business is all about. Unfortunately, when you talk business, to the majority of farmers and the population in Africa, you're talking extractive big business. But surely there's space for creating businesses that are win-win for organized communities. And that's where I feel the issue of cooperatives and bringing in women to be part of that business cycle will make a difference in the adoption of research. And then finally, the issue of targeting. I think there is a generalization that everybody who is in the rural areas prioritizes farming, but there are people who've moved out of farming. So we need to go back and identify who are the bona fide farmers and what levels are they at and what assets do they need to achieve sustainable production levels. And knowledge is key, and documentation and capturing of performance and benchmarking of actual performance will be key in all this. And we've got to do it together. It can't be researchers on their own without the farmers. It's got to be participatory. And I believe that's what it takes for research to adapt to the needs of the smallholder farmers. It's a partnership, and it's got to be that way.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sibanda. Dr. Wang, what is the role of science in supporting farmer cooperatives and small and medium-sized businesses in developing countries?
It's a very stimulating question. During the recent years, I have had a lot of interactions with agribusiness, with farmer cooperatives in the developing countries, particularly in China. And I left my field of managing research in recent years. And I've noticed one phenomenon has really struck me. That is a profound change in the rural institutions in these developing countries, particularly in Asia. Let me just quickly quote that in India nowadays, more than 95% of the farmers are involved in one way or another with a farmer growers association or self-helping groups. In Andhra Pradesh, for instance, there's a strong movement of women's self-helping groups. And in the past 5 or so years, there has been $650 million of investment in facilitating this movement, this process. And primarily, the support also included from the United States, the World Bank, and the FAO, and the government of India. In Vietnam, also, farmers' associations, very strong movement. In China, in 2007, the government of China set forth a farmers' cooperative law. And then after that, in 4 years, by the end of 2012, there were 550,000 farmer cooperatives registered. So that covers about 11% of the total Chinese farming families. And comparing with these two countries, I'm not mentioning Brazil. We'll hear from our president of Embrapa, Dr. Mauricio. But in China and India, you see the differences between a more sort of formal way of farmer cooperatives, whereas in India, where farmers and the government have learned that in the previous years there has been some unsuccessful experiences of more formal ways of farmer cooperatives. But now emphasis perhaps is more on the informal ways. But one way or another, formal or informal, depending on the context of the country, I think that the point is that there's I call it a quiet revolution is happening in the way because of the main drivers nowadays in the rural development and agriculture. And these drivers include, not to mention all of them, the increase of input in agriculture production, the labor, the urbanization, the change of labor composition in the rural areas, for instance, not only in China, but also in other emerging economies and countries, feminization in agriculture production, okay? And also the development of markets, partly or also largely driven by domestic and the international trade, and the policy environment, and so on and so forth. So there is a strong movement towards rural institution change, towards organization of farmers. So the question now comes to what you pointed out, Barbara, is the role of science. What is needed for the research community and for the science and technology in supporting such a development? Okay, the point I would like to make, or I like to advocate, is that the science community as well as the government needs to pay particular attention to this space. I think that an increased investment and also particularly development of a new research paradigm to support this development in this axis of science and technology innovation, technology transfer, and agribusiness development is going to be the place for really the breakthroughs in rural development, poverty alleviation. Now, just very briefly, exactly, what are the roles, maybe the science, in certain fields? Okay, the mushrooming of these small sort of to medium-sized enterprises in rural areas will have almost an intrinsic drawback in terms of management of business and quality control to meet this, the market sort of requirement for standards, for product qualities and standards. And that's where the regulatory issues can come in, and the science, quality controls, and the international standards for market standards can come in to help. Capacity building, okay, technological backstopping for these small, medium-sized enterprises to enhance access to markets, information, utilizing the modern IT technologies, for instance, and to enhance the physical means, for instance, including the cold chains, for instance, for transporting and distributing products. Okay. And also for social sciences and economic analysis, okay, analyzing the trend, to providing some guidance towards the development of these small, medium enterprises. And there's the gender dimension also, very, very critical. What would be the produce or products and technologies that are particularly suitable for women farmers and producers? Okay. So all of these issues would involve a significant part of the research community, the technological innovations to come into play. So, and then another point is the linkage of research communities with the extension and with financing institutions, not only private sector investors, but also banks, be it government or private, financing institutions. And I think that's going to lead a new revolution in the developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Begemann, as public research and development budgets globally face continued shortages, what is the best way for the private sector to contribute to innovation in agriculture?
Yes, thank you, Barbara, and thanks to the rest of the panel of the discussion. It's a pleasure to be here and visit about a very important topic for all of us. I work at Monsanto, and I've had the opportunity over the past number of years to walk with farmers in agriculture on 6 different continents. And one of the things that has always struck me is the resiliency of farmers, regardless of scale, whether they're large or small. What also strikes me is their openness to innovation and improving, again, regardless of scale. I also realize that regardless of scale, agriculture is tough. Agriculture is a business where you're basically running a manufacturing plant outside. You have to put up with Mother Nature, who can throw you a lot of curves and twists. And again, that can affect you whether you're large or small. As I think about it from a researcher's perspective at Monsanto, and the work that we do, we spend close to $1 billion a year on R&D. Somewhere around half of that is on making better seeds. The other half of that is looking for ways that we can protect that seed, either through biotechnology or other crop protection tools, to ensure that that seed has the utmost potential to create as much yield as possible for the farmer. I think one of the things that I look at when I look at can I call it the more challenged parts of the world, whether that be Africa, parts of Asia, parts of South America, on how do we increase the productivity, it comes down to the more basic things. It's the farmer having the basic tools available to them, like hybrid seed. It's the farmer having basic agronomic knowledge, who can teach them how to produce that crop, how to use the right fertilizer, how to use the right production system, when to plant, how to harvest it, and then information about the crop that they're growing. It continues to amaze me when you think about, if I go off on a tangent here for just 1 minute, the subsistence farmer in many parts of the world growing a crop for no other means than to feed the family. And Mother Nature has an impact on that. We need to consider that they have no economic incentive to produce too much, because if they produce too much, there's no market for them to take it to. And if there's no market for them to take it to, they throw it away. So their motivation is produce enough to feed the family. And then a bad year comes along and they don't produce enough and they starve. That, to me, is a really bad day, where all we need to do is work together to create a marketplace. Then as the scale starts to grow a bit, credit, financing, risk management starts to become important, even for the smallholder farmer. And when I look at that, even though they're basic, simple things, it's really complex. And I don't think any organization or company can address it by themselves. That's why I appreciate processes like this, where we can get together and discuss how do we work on it together. Because it's together that I think that we can make the biggest difference for the farmer. And if we centralize our focus and our energy around the farmer and build out from there, so that ultimately the farmer is better off, I believe they're most receptive to innovation in any market in the world, and they will help us get it done when we show them a better path. I want to give you 3 specific examples of where I think private industry can help out, but it's private industry working in public partnerships. First of all, in Africa, couldn't be more proud of the work that's going on with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Dr. Horsch with the water-efficient maize efforts in Africa. I hope that this year we plant seeds from that program in Kenya. Huge step in breeding hybrid corn seeds to improve the production in water-stressed situations, specifically for Africa, specifically for African farmers. I believe we will get there. I believe it will make a significant difference. And it's the commitment of over a number of years of hanging together and continuing to work it that makes me most proud, that I think the outcome will be self-explanatory and it will encourage others to follow along behind. Information. I take you to India. We put a small system in place a few years ago to talk to farmers over cell phones and text messages, how to communicate to them basic agronomic issues around growing their crop. Today, we're using that system on 6 different crops. We're reaching about 800,000 farmers a year, telling them basic things like when to plant, when to harvest, how to treat the crop, how to fertilize, when to fertilize, etc. It is really motivating to sit with those farmers that you've had the opportunity to work with and see the impact that you're making in their life by those small pieces of agronomic information helping them increase their productivity. And then to Latin America, finally, where we've put pilot systems in place, working specifically with farmers, looking specifically at financing and risk management to increase the incentive for them to invest more in their crop, to increase the productivity, having financing to help allow them to do that with risk management tools on the back end so that they don't get strung out if Mother Nature doesn't cooperate. So I think those are 3 examples of where, as a private company, we can work with the public and put systems in place to drive productivity to address a really challenging issue. But I would end saying it works best when we work together because no one of us can do it on our own.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Lopes, Brazilian agricultural productivity has grown exponentially. How has Brazil balanced its production and environmental sustainability goals? What can be learned from the Brazilian model, and how is it relevant for African and South Asian countries? And I think we're all very interested in Brazil.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Barbara Schaal. My compliments to all members of this panel. I'd like to thank the Chicago Council for this invitation and for the possibility to be here dialoguing with all of you. Well, before the 1970s, Brazil was not exactly a food-secure country. We were basically known as the producer of coffee and sugar, but at that time we had to import most of our staples, rice and beans and milk. And in a very short period of time, 40 years, Brazil was able to become a food-secure country. And beyond that, Brazil was able to project itself as an important provider of food to the world. And many people ask how Brazil was able to do this. It was a combination of things, a combination of factors, and I think the most important one is government decision. The Brazilian government took really hard decisions at an important time to build and to strengthen institutions. Embrapa was created at that time. The strengthening of our universities, a bold decision to hire and to send to different parts of the world thousands of young researchers for training. That made all the difference to us. And also public policies to create an enabling environment for the development of tropical agriculture in Brazil. It had a tremendous impact on our country. If we compare, in the middle of the 70s, we had about 30 million hectares cultivated in Brazil. And since then, we doubled the cultivated area with grains, but we were able to multiply by 6 our agricultural output. Então, I would say that Brazil moved fast towards sustainability, investing in the development of a science-based agriculture that helped us to increase productivity, to increase efficiency. We had increases of between 60 and 200% in the efficiency of our crop and animal production systems in Brazil. Due to this increasing efficiency, we were able to save land, to reduce the expansion of agriculture over sensitive environments. As you know, Brazil is a quite complex country. We are a mega diverse country. And contrary to what many people around the world think, Brazil still has over 60% of its forests is still preserved, is still untouched. Over 80% of the Amazon is untouched. because we have been able to develop technologies and strategies to increase our agricultural output without excessive expansion in area. For instance, no-tillage technology. 20 years ago, Brazil had 4 million hectares of no-tillage grain production. Today, we have over 30 million hectares. It was a tremendous development in a technology which brings more sustainability, more security to agricultural production in the country. And we are now working on public policies, and I stress this. Public policies are very key here. We have to work with our government. We have to work with our policymakers if we are to make substantial advances in bringing new concepts of sustainable agriculture into reality. Brazil passed recently its new environmental law, which is aimed at keeping our 60+% of natural areas untouched. We have a new public policy for agriculture of low carbon, stimulating the use of integrated systems, sustainable intensification. So I think we developed in Brazil a concept, a modern concept of farming in the tropics. Obviously, this information and this experience is being shared with many countries around the world, including countries especially in Africa and in Latin America. And we believe very much in the concept of co-development, not bringing our technologies to Africa or Asia or Latin America, but working together with these countries, trying to develop a system and to adapt what we've learned in Brazil in other parts of the world. We think this is the way to proceed in this cooperation, the South-South cooperation.
Thank you very much. Dr. Horsch, the Gates Foundation is pioneering models for partnerships that will allow greater sharing of technical expertise between countries. Which countries are best positioned to lend the most scientific support to developing countries, and have you seen any models that successfully share expertise?
Thank you, Barbara. That's really a difficult question. Who to take off the list? We have found great expertise pretty much everywhere we've looked. And the obvious suspects nowadays, Brazil, China, and India, we have large collaborative projects with the governments and institutions in those countries to look at problems primarily in sub-Saharan Africa and identify specific ideas, specific research agendas, specific product development opportunities that will help meet the needs of those smallholder farmers. Because those three countries have done such a good job with their own agricultural development, they've developed the capacity and the technical knowledge to be good partners with Africa, which is our main focus. The old guard, the developed countries, the US, Europe, Australia, and other developed countries like that, remain very important partners. And a lot of very cutting-edge science is coming out of laboratories in the developed world. We also look for ways to partner with either academic or government laboratories anywhere in the world where the expertise can be found. Again, the guide for us is who's got the ideas, who's got the science, who's got the know-how to do the work to develop the products that's going to meet the needs. But there's also incredible capacity in the developing world itself. And one of the key things we're trying to accomplish is to find and foster and develop the leadership and the capabilities locally, because those are the people that best know the problems locally. And while there are a lot of global technologies relevant to agriculture, it's inherently a local activity. And that local adaptation is so critical that both knowing what's needed and knowing what it's going to take to solve that need really requires that local expertise. And the final partner for us is actually the farmers themselves, because they know it better than anybody. And the broad approach we bring is to offer farmers choices, because we can't really be sure we can guess and know what farmers are going to want. But to offer choices, see what choices are made, and develop a feedback loop. A large part of our, we call it, it used to be called extension. We now call it knowledge exchange, because it's a two-way flow of information from researchers and development organizations with farmers to find out both what they need, how well things work, and feed that back into the research. Let me just close mentioning a few specific partnerships that draw developing country institutions and scientists into the program. The oldest is the BREAD program we have with the National Science Foundation. BREAD stands for Basic Research to Enable Agricultural Development. And by partnering with the National Science Foundation, which has to support US research, with our money on the table, we can bring in funding for developing country or other country scientists, whoever has the best tools at hand. And then a newer program we call PEARLS, which is a program to support emerging agricultural research leaders in the developing world, partnering with them and with developed world scientists to support their careers and to support the projects that they're working on. Thank you.
Thank you. And now to Dr. Garza. The nexus between agriculture and health is increasingly being explored. You have worked in the medical and food assistance communities. How can agriculture alter its research agenda to produce better nutritional outcomes, especially those that will lead to reductions in stunting and wasting?
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, my fellow panelists and the Chicago Council for this opportunity to be with you today. One of the challenges of being the last panelist to speak is that most of the panelists have covered issues that in fact, you want to raise. But that means one can perhaps be more efficient as well. There are four principal things that I think one can do if stunting and improving child health are the goals. First are partnerships. You'll see what I mean by that in a bit. The second is what I call extension and dialogue. A third is investing in people, because as you'll see from my comments that I'm about to make, we can't achieve that goal without continuing to invest in the education and training of individuals. And then lastly, it's having an agricultural framework that is intentionally designed to promote health in a sustainable manner, secure in exploiting science. And too often, I think, we have almost worked as if agriculture existed for its own sake, as opposed to existing in the service of mankind. Well, there is a myth among many settings of this kind that we don't know how to make healthy children. We gather experts together to come up with new solutions, when in actuality, all we have to do is look within our homes. We have healthy children all over the place. The recipe is one that we discovered eons ago. There is nothing magic about it. And so much of what I will say, I think, will be somewhat self-evident. It has to be comprehensive. One cannot omit any part of what I'm going to say and expect to have a healthy child. Many years ago, I was at a meeting with the World Food Program with a number of government ministers and bankers. And I was having difficulty trying to imagine how I could communicate a biological truth to such a group. And I decided to describe Mother Nature as the world's most unforgiving banker. She doesn't know the term debt abatement. On the other hand, she can be the world's most generous of bankers. What do I mean by that? There are certain needs that a child has that has to be met on a certain schedule. And if we fail to meet that schedule, we pay with interest for the remainder of our lives, not only the child's life. On the other hand, if we meet that payment schedule, the results are fabulous. Look at your own children, your own grandchildren. Mother Nature can be extremely generous if we meet that schedule. So comprehensive. Key to this, the first 1,000 days, as the report says. Most stunting occurs, if not the bulk of all stunting, within the first 1,000 days of a child's life. But truly, it begins even before postnatal life. So what do we have to do? What is it that we know? First, educate women. If we could have only one public health goal, that would probably be it. Probably the most significant thing we can do to prevent stunting. Second, create a framework in that agricultural context where women control significant household resources. At all costs, try to keep it from the men. We do terrible things. Promote intentional pregnancies, a healthy pregnancy. Support breastfeeding exclusively for the first 6 months, with continued breastfeeding for at least 2 years. Quality complementary feeding, which means bringing together the private and the public sector, food science and agriculture, because without adequate complementary feeding, we will never solve the problem of stunting in any setting. Making sure that we address some key nutrients, iron, zinc, in some settings, selenium, vitamin A, the B complex, etc. But it's very context-driven. Clean environments, absolutely essential, including clean water. Meeting recommended pediatric care. Making sure that, in fact, there's good household care that includes safe and reliable opportunities for physical activity. What do I mean by that? There's some very nice data that unfortunately is not well known, developed in Guatemala almost 30 years or 40 years ago, where nutrients are used much more efficiently in children that have the ability to engage in physical activity in ways that we all take for granted in most developed settings, but often are not available to children in others. Well, there's also an emerging science of what we don't know. And possibly one of the most exciting, and I won't bore you very long with this, is something called microRNAs, a work that's emerging from China, suggesting that in fact there may be a new category of nutrient that we know very little about, but may begin to explain some of the very substantial health benefits that we see from predominantly plant-based diets. So in all of this, partnerships among the health, the private sector, the food science sector, to be able to achieve a healthy child's, the goal of healthy children. Investing in people because it's absolutely essential if we're going to meet those needs. Extension and dialogue, absolutely key. And perhaps for our audience, the most important is the intentional development of an agricultural framework that takes health as its primary goal. As much as I love farm animals, the reason why we have them and plant foods is because, in fact, we want to promote the well-being of all humans. So health as a primary motivating factor for developing that framework. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you. I think the Chicago Council has done an amazing job of collecting individuals with incredibly different viewpoints and different expertise. And I think it does a beautiful job of illustrating the vast landscape of agriculture and the importance of science in many, many different areas. But what's really clear from the discussion that we've had, this very brief discussion already, is that science alone is not sufficient, that we need to have policy, we need to have partnerships, we need to have extension. So at this point, what is on the agenda is to open this up to the panelists and to allow them to comment, to query other panel members, and so really to have a discussion among us that really fleshes out some of the issues that we've been bringing forward. And let me take the chair's prerogative. I want to ask a question of Dr. Lopes, and that is, it's very difficult sometimes to marshal an entire country to have policies that work together and are cohesive. It's a challenge, I think, for any country, and I think Brazil has been remarkable in doing that. How was it possible to get science and policy and this uniform direction in Brazil? What was the transformative events that led to that?
Well, I think one major factor that helped us to have the right decisions and the right policies at that moment was that we had no model of tropical agriculture to mimic. We had a tremendous problem, a country of the size of Brazil, with a huge environmental base, huge landscape to be used, but we didn't have a model to work on or to start with. So at that point, we had to decide to create or to develop our own model. I think this was a major driving force to bring together different forces in our society and to really help Brazil to take a serious decision to build and to strengthen institutions, and also, and most important, to train people. Capacity building was something that we really took seriously. As a matter of fact, we are doing it again now. Our government has a very bold program called Science Without Frontier, and we are going to send to different parts of the world until 2015, 100,000 young Brazilians for training and capacity building, undergrad and graduate level. So very serious decisions related to building capacity and preparing people to face the challenge. Brazil has a very unique situation. We have a great potential to grow and increase our agricultural production, but we are also a mega diverse country. We have 6 very complex biomes, and we are also, I think this is also something that moves us to look at the solutions that help us to reconcile these two fronts, the conservation, the sustainable use of our natural resource base, and the need to increase our agricultural production and our agricultural output. It's not easy, but fortunately we've been able to take hard decisions, to live with them for quite a long time. If you create institutions, you better be prepared to sustain them for quite a long time, because everything you start today in research and development will yield results in sometimes a very long time, 5, 10, 15 years. So we cannot think short term. And I think we've learned to do this in Brazil. Recently, in Embrapa, in the past 10 years, my organization was able to double its budget. In 2009, we were able to hire 1,000 new researchers, which I think shows clearly that our government understands what's going on in the world, understand the challenge that we have ahead of us, and understand the role that Brazil has to play in matters of food security and nutritional security in the world.
Thank you. Other panelists, comments, questions? Yeah.
Can I follow that up? What was the driving force for creating the political will that enabled all of those incredible changes in a relatively small period of time, or short period of time?
Well, it's important to say this because most of the real important decisions were taken in a moment that we didn't have democracy. It was the time of, I mentioned to you, it's something a bit complicated to talk about and to discuss, but it's true. At that time, we had a military government, and even though many bad things happened in Brazil due to the military government, but we fortunately at that time we were able to discuss and to develop some real important structuring projects and activities, and this was one of them. It was in a way easier at that time to reach consensus and to drive and to drive change. So I have to tell you that this had an impact on what happened in Brazil.
Yes.
Yeah, if I may make an intervention. I'm listening to Mauricio's comment. I was quite intrigued, actually. I'm thinking, you know, as we all know, that the Chinese models of development featuring a strong government intervention. And that model may not be suitable for other countries, developing countries, for instance, in Africa and even India. And now, in comparison also, there's has been a limitation for the interventions of organizations like the one that I'm working with now, the FAO, with the Intergovernmental UN Agency, which almost by definition has to work through the national government, rather than reaching out to farmers' associations and these informal organizations. Except maybe in countries like India, FAO is working very actively with the self-helping groups, women groups is directly involved. So this sort of international organizations intervention with farmer associations, with farmers sort of directly, vis-a-vis government interventions, I think can play a very important role, but it should be in a complementary manner. And I think that the role that international centers, for instance, can play in strengthening this sort of scientific backstopping. For instance, the consultative group on international agricultural research, the CGIAR centers. The CGIAR centers, one way or another, have always worked with smallholding farmers. But how do you reach this sort of a balance or optimum of working through the government or respecting the national sovereignty and so on with the NARS, as well as providing support to farmers' associations, to the business development directly? I think that's going to be quite an interesting challenge.
Barbara, can I come in
Yes.
on that one? I think what we really are grappling with here is a powerful global supply system in terms of research and technology, and no base for absorption at national level. And unless we stimulate investment in research at national level, we cannot adopt, because we have to adapt these technologies to local conditions. So the priority would be for our governments to realize that investing in research is key, but there's got to be tangible benefits that they see from that investment, and that's where the partnerships are key. So I think what I take from the Brazil example is this investment in people, all round. Private sector being there, bold leadership from government, and also the farmers who have capacity, plus the researchers that are trained and can relate to their local environment. So I think that is key.
Any other comments on Brazil? It's a remarkable story. So I think we're really open to any of your comments about the other presentations. I think there's some very interesting themes have been developed.
So I had a question, Barbara, for Dr. Horsch at the Gates Foundation. It always amazes me the level of interest, whether it be from governments, from private institutions, NGOs, et cetera, to work on solving these issues.
Yeah.
Anywhere you go, you can find that interest. From your experience working different countries around the world, different agencies, different private companies, what do you see that is the nugget that brings it together to where we actually make real progress? We bring that interest and really drive to an outcome. What do you see from the Gates Foundation that others of us could model behind to accelerate the successes that we're having?
Well, the key is to focus on the farmer. As Borlaug said, take it to the farmer. If you start with what farmers need, that's the guide to how do you pull together a program. The world is full of great intentions, and probably the biggest struggle we have is to help shape those great intentions to something that's most likely to be useful. Scientists love their science. Companies love their products. Countries love all kinds of stuff. No, there's a lot of understandable, necessary political agendas inside governments. There's survival instincts and sort of self-interest at a country level. But what we find is once you get past those natural and obvious starting biases, people really do want to do what's best, what's effective. And Bill has talked about this in his annual letter this year and with visits to FAO and other agencies, that if we can measure progress, if we can measure the beneficial outcomes and the impacts, that will provide a less biased guide towards effective development and delivery of what's needed.
Yes.
Well, my comment is not really related to, I think in a way it's related to many issues that we discussed here. But I think it's very clear that we are moving into an age of great complexity. We are dealing with very complex issues related to global change, the need to decarbonize our economies, the need to increase food production. And in my view, I think we use very little the concept of strategic intelligence in agriculture and in agricultural production, in the whole discussion. I think there aren't many, say, think tanks around the world thinking about the future of agriculture and the challenges that we have ahead of us. I think we need more strategic thinking, we need more foresight, we need a better capacity to anticipate the possible futures and deal with the decisions which are needed to face these possible futures. I give an example. We talk about global change as a unique thing that will pose some challenges to agriculture, but global change will have to be understood in a country-specific manner, in a region-specific manner, and sometimes in a site-specific manner, because it will affect different crops in different settings, in different places, in different ways. And I don't think we are investing enough in strategic thinking, in analysis, in foresight, in anticipation, to try to reconcile many of the views and the lack of a good knowledge of this complexity in which agriculture and food production is immersed. And just a comment on Dr. Horsch. I mentioned the situation in Brazil, but by no means I meant to say that I liked it. It was just a factual thing. I mean, it's a fact. But it really, that situation brought really hard impacts to Brazil. I didn't like it at all. But some things happened there that had impacted today. That was just the comment that I intended to make.
I totally agree with you on the issue of more think tanks, more foresight. If you look at the situation in Africa now, there's only 5% of think tanks globally that are available in Africa, involved in policy analysis and informing the debate. But I think we need to up the game and make sure that we also develop the capacity of civil society to use the evidence that is generated. I think the other disjoint between the supply in terms of evidence and also taking that to the political level is really unpacking who advises our policymakers. And that's where think tanks that are at local level with known messengers who are equipped with the science, with the evidence to inform the process would expedite the uptake of evidence in informing policy process.
Yeah.
Currently, there's very few institutions that have the capacity, and in some countries, they don't exist at all. So investing in people, investing in think tanks, investing in these multidisciplinary stakeholder platforms that will inform the policy debate would make a big difference in terms of Africa owning the agenda and making sure we put investments in there.
If I may say a few words on this, I think we kind of think that organizations dedicated to research and development are primarily responsible to develop new products, new processes, but I think we are also responsible to producing knowledge and information that will empower policymakers to take best decisions. Many institutions do not take as their responsibility to make the knowledge and information that they generate flow to inform the process of improving and building new policies. I think there is a tremendous lack of good policies for agriculture and to food production around the world. And I think the scientific world has a lot to do here. We have to communicate to our researchers, to our scientists, that besides producing innovation, I think one of their key responsibilities is also producing and communicating knowledge and information to empower the process of driving and improving policies.
Dr. Garza?
No, they've said it.
We have a question from Twitter, and this is from Hallie Thompson. Long-term projects are often hard to sustain in academic research settings. How can we improve institutional memory and institutional partnerships? The panel is stunned.
Can I make a comment? And I served as one of the international centers, deputy director general for Rice Institute for more than 7 years, and also the director of the CGIAR system for 3 years, and then with China also. One of the really lessons I really learned, and I have been advocating this to the Chinese government in the past several years, is that no matter it's an international organization or international centers or national research, we must try hard to alter the nature, the kind of investment to research. Exactly as you pointed out, this is a question from Twitter. That is, at the moment, all of these centers, international centers, as well as the national research centers, specifically has about 25 to 30% of its revenue or its funding as what we call unrestricted core funding that can sustain the research and supporting for longer-term research. 65 to 70% of the funding is project-funded, sort of a restricted funding that has a limited usage. In that way, we cannot really sustain this longer-term research and with a foresight and so on. I was going to make a heavier comment on that. Yeah. If we are serious about the global food security in long term, we must alter this percentage, this way of investment. We must increase unrestricted, longer-term, stable support to agriculture research.
Yeah. Rob? Okay.
Well, I certainly would agree with Ren's assessment. What I was going to say was we need to keep our eye on the ball, and to do that, we got to agree on what the ball is. And I think if we lay out in a crisp way those key outcomes that we're after long term, then as the technology changes and as regimes change, we can keep pursuing the same goals. And I think that was one of Brazil's successes. I mean, if you look at it, the soil health of the Cerrado was a key limitation, and your scientists developed the solutions to improve the health of the Cerrado soil. Then your breeders developed the tropical soybean varieties that could flourish in it, and you invested in the infrastructure to get it out to market. And there was those at its core, fairly simple elements that just very powerfully were able to transform productivity in Brazil. We've got some key elements in nutrition. We've got some key elements in agriculture sustainability globally. Dan, in his comments this morning, mentioned the importance of water. That's a technical challenge that I think can be used as a guiding principle for prioritizing investments across the board. And let me take 1 minute to just suggest a different way to think about water as the limiting factor that we can do the least about in the long term, because it's such a massive biophysical global limitation that we have to make the best use of what we have. And in Africa, the biggest way water is wasted is by low soil fertility. Most of the rainfall, most of the human labor that is used in Africa is wasted for lack of soil nutrients. In other places, it would be crop diseases take most of the water productivity away from the harvest. In other places, it would be just low potential varieties, poor quality seed. But whatever the rate limiting thing is, it's all much more fixable than bringing more water than is already available.
Lindiwe?
I was just going to come back on the issue of institutional memory, because for me it's really about trust and investment for the long term. For as long as the funding is short term, nobody would want to leave a career to come and sustain something that has no future. And secondly, it's about capacity building. For as long as we're not feeding the pipeline with young people who are entering into agriculture and seeing it as a lucrative career to be engaged in, we're always going to have a situation whereby we have successes and there's nobody to scale up that success. So long-term investments and capacity building and attracting young people into professions in agriculture throughout the value chain are key for institutional memory.
And one other dimension I think that's key for that long-term investment is defining those simple goals in human terms or showing the human face to that. And I'll give you a very brief example of how I learned that lesson. That was several years ago when we decided to investigate what the economics of success would look like. What do I mean by that? In the US, what would happen if indeed everyone ate the way they were supposed to eat? Everyone remained physically active as we were supposed to be. All of us went for preventive care. What would our economy look like? The expectation was the goal that we would save money. We were stunned because we'd go broke. Why would we go broke? Because we defined the goal in monetary terms. People would be living longer. Social Security would go broke. And rather than, and so that if the goal was saving money, guess what the most effective public health tool we could use? Get everybody to smoke. Because we die at 65, consuming health probably in the last years of our life, but in fact leaving quite a bit of savings for the remainder of the 65 years that we failed to extend our lives. If we had redefined those goals in human well-being and in other terms, in fact, the sustainability of those efforts might have been realized. So very key, I think, in achieving that goal is to define it in as human terms as we can, rather than always seeking a much more monetized way of defining the outcome. It's a challenge, I think.
I think just one small add to that question is and several have said it, maybe I'm just saying it with different words to make myself feel better. So often when we start down a project, we have an outcome in mind. And we do really good scoping out what that outcome is that we're all after. But what I see us not do so well is to lay out the milestones along the way. So along the way, we don't really know whether we're making progress towards our outcome or not. And if we can see along the way that we're making progress by hitting those milestones, we all probably have a lot more confidence for sustainable investment to continue to work towards that future outcome that we want. But we need to be measuring the progress to know that it's working and we're getting there. And I think if, from my standpoint, that's the one thing that I would add to much of what we do and others, is to think about those milestones so we know if we're having success. Because if we're not, we probably should be stopping and redirecting the resources to something that is having success.
Dr. Lopes.
No, just a quick comment on this issue that I didn't see much discussed, which is the difference between the academic world, which has the main responsibility to generate knowledge, which is added to the pool of knowledge, and the need for organizations, research and development organizations, with emphasis in development, in solving problems. Many times, these two concepts are confused. Confused because people that go to research and development organizations that are supposed to develop solutions to the real world, they are trained in academics, in organizations which are deal with generating more knowledge to put to the pool of knowledge. I think we have to discuss this more. Today, what kind of development organizations are needed in order for us to be able to deal with problems of the dimension that are here in front of us, that will need a different approach. I think many people around the world ask me this question: why Embrapa has been able to be successful? Sometimes I tell them we have a Cerrado, a Savannah Center, that is operating for 40 years, and we have in that center the memory of everything that has been done in Brazil to develop the Brazilian savannas as one of the prime agricultural areas in the world. If we had done that, dispersed in many places, maybe that knowledge wouldn't have been organized as it is today. So I think we must think a bit about it, the difference of the science which is needed in development organizations, or organizations geared towards solving problems and boosting development, and organizations which are the main responsibilities to generate and to improve the pool of knowledge of society.
Barbara?
My quick response to that one would be, we need to move or transition from research for development to research in development. And that means bringing in partnerships that we are not comfortable with, but that have a stake towards the impact that we want to see. And that's calling for new skills that most of our researchers don't currently have. It's calling for new partnerships, and it's also calling for policy leadership, bold leadership, where government is comfortable with the direction of all these multidisciplinary teams that are engaging with the farmers, researching in development, not for development. That way, innovation from the farmer, from the outside world, will interface and lead to change, rather than develop and pass on.
Yeah, if I can react to that, I think we had this paradigm of science for society. Yep. Science here, society there. Yep. I think we are moving into science with society.
That's the one.
And some people say that in the future we'll have society in science. We are talking about crowd science, right?
Yep.
So we may have such thing in the near future.
I think that's a very important dimension, but as long as we don't lose sight, as we're trying to drive that important agenda, to just supporting science for the sake of science.
Yes.
Because curiosity has brought marvelous things to humanity in terms of solutions that we couldn't originally envision. And if we become completely utilitarian in our approaches, then I think we lose a lot of human creativity. So the issue is one of balance and not of either or. I know in this country, very often politicians now are becoming increasingly focused on the utilitarian nature of everything that happens in academic institutions, not understanding that many of the advances that we enjoy today, we enjoy because somebody's curiosity spurred it on, and the government at that time was wise enough to support their satisfying that curiosity. So it's a matter of balance. I think either approach, if taken to the extreme, can be non-productive. But in the appropriate balance, can be quite rich.
I completely agree with that, and all the time I was talking about reaching this balance. Yeah.
Other comments on this? There's, I wanted to just direct one last topic. We have about 5 more minutes. But much of our conversation about agricultural development has been rightly focused on rural communities. But populations are migrating to urban areas at a very rapid pace. And so the question is, how will we need to alter our research agenda, our policies, et cetera, to support both urban and rural food security? And I just throw that out there. Dr. Wang?
Yes, I want to jump in this topic and somewhat relate to the point that I brought to this Chicago Council Symposium purposely. And that is, first of all, I think, yes, it is an unavoidable trend now, the urbanization and the migration of people from rural to urban. Again, using China as an example, which I'm familiar with. At the moment, as many of us know, in China, at any time, there are 250 million people migrated from rural to urban areas. And urbanization is the issue. The point is to ensure food and nutrition security for not only rural but also urban. We have to focus on the overall availability of quality, safe, nutritious food at an affordable price. I mean, that is our objective. And then so you cannot look at only people move to urban to becoming urban dwellers and salary earners, but also looking at increasing productivity and resource use efficiency and the business really in the rural, in the countryside production. That's one. The other point I really like to make is, once again, I think in this dimension, public research, I'm not talking about private research. Public research is once again falling behind the development trend of this urbanization. Just give you an example. Again, see in China now, in the peri-urban areas, suburban areas, you see thousands, 10,000s of hectares of continuous greenhouses for urban, peri-urban production, vegetables and livestock production in plastic tunnels or greenhouses. What is the efficiency of natural resource use, land use efficiency? What is the implications to the environment? These have not been carefully studied by the research community. Again, falling behind. The role of a public, international, particularly international public goods research in addressing this new dimension. We have to appreciate that today, that one of the main reasons that I can sit here enjoying such a conversation is because of the green revolution, that the food security has been brought as a result of the public research by ERI, by CIMMYT, by the national government, national research systems, and that were funded in the 1980s or so at about 90% as unrestricted funding to the international centers. Okay, but now we do not have that anymore. We're falling behind. So addressing this issue, again, I think the Chicago Council's suggestion for the US government to double your investment over the next 10 years in agriculture research is spot on. And also with an emphasis on partnership with international public research is spot on. Thank you.
Just 1 second.
Sure.
I think agriculture has a vital role to play in curbing the rural to urban migration, because the reason why people move into towns from where I come from is in search of jobs and better lives. And unless we invest in rural areas, unless we increase productivity in a sustainable way so that those who are in farming are genuinely producing the food and there is no need to increase more land. But more important, we create value addition opportunities closest to where the food is produced. And I think that will reverse the tide of wanting to go into towns to look for jobs, because the rural areas will be lucrative places for both a healthy livelihood and for employment creation. So I think it's up to our governments to invest more in the rural areas and look at the whole value chain of agriculture and create jobs, particularly for the youth. Then we can arrest the rural-urban migration.
At this point, I think we're out of time, and that is a lovely way to conclude. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our very distinguished panel and also the Chicago Council for arranging this wonderful discussion. Thank you all very much.